Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for attending tonight. My name is Teresa Tangney, and I'm one of the librarians here at Thomas Crane. We are really excited to be able to partner with March Forward Quincy for our second in the series of Brave Spaces community conversations about social justice, and to partner for the first time with Dove. And we're joined tonight by Jen Bolton from Dove, who you'll be introduced to in a few minutes. And if you're interested, we did one of these programs back in October. The first one was we partnered with Quincy for Transformative Change to discuss Black Lives Matter. And that program is recorded on our YouTube channel. So if you're interested in going back and taking a look at that recording, it's there for you. I'd just like to thank the Friends of the Thomas Crane Library. They do a lot for us. And tonight they have provided closed captioning services. So if you need closed captioning, there's a little CC button on the bottom of Zoom. And you can click that to get the captions to come up. We'll be doing breakout rooms a little bit later on, and I'll mention this again before we do the breakout rooms, but if you are using the closed captioning, please just send me a message and you can stay in the main room to keep the closed captioning on. And now I'm going to introduce Nicole from March Forward Quincy just to talk a little bit about their organization, and then we'll get started. Thank you.
So my name is Nicole DePace, and I am a part of the steering committee for March Forward Quincy, and have been part of the planning group working with Thomas Crane and the community organizations to launch this program. So we're very happy that this is the second of what is hoped to be a series of conversations. And March Forward Quincy is a community activist group that is progressive. And our mission is to contribute to a welcoming community in Quincy that is well informed, and we want to make sure that everyone feels included and involved in the city of Quincy. We are very excited and happy to be working with the library again. The library has been a wonderful partner for our groups and groups like ours to be able to gather and to meet and to inform the community. And very excited to have agreed to help lead my second community conversation this evening. And so we really welcome their expertise and leadership in this conversation. And what we had hoped that this series would do was create space for residents of Quincy, and if you don't live in Quincy, that's okay too. But for people to be able to gather and have conversations about social justice and about topics that often we don't talk about openly, and that many of us need a lot more practice in being able to confront and to deal with. And so tonight's conversation is meant to open up dialogue in our city around issues centered on domestic and gender-based violence, and thinking about how that intersects with other social justice issues. And so Dove chose reading materials and things for us to watch and to think about to help inform this discussion. And so at this point, and I also want to say we have Patty Mortimer here tonight from March Forward as well. And depending on the size of the group, we may or may not use the breakout rooms, and Patty and myself will help moderate breakout rooms depending on how many folks end up joining us in total. But at this point, I'd like to hand it over to Jen so she can introduce herself.
We're really excited about partnering with you all for this event. Like we said, anyone attending, you don't have to have read the book in order to join the conversation tonight, but if you haven't gotten a chance to read it yet, I would highly, highly recommend it. It was an excellent book, very beautifully written, and also very heartbreaking. So the book is about a woman who was recalling and more of the experience of her mother, who was killed by her stepfather. She writes about what it was like to be biracial, growing up in the recently desegregated South, and what it was like to have a mother that was Black, a father that was white, a grandmother that was very interested in social justice and how that kind of formed her. And then she continues to write a very loving and heartbreaking story about the murder of her mother. So we're going to talk a little bit more about domestic violence in general, about some of what made it so hard for her mother to leave, what systems sort of ended up failing her in the end. We want to hear a little bit, we're going to take a few minutes to just hear from the author herself. So I'm going to show just a short segment of an interview that she did on PBS. And then we're just going to take kind of a few minutes to open up the conversation. Anyone here can share just some sort of general thoughts that they might have had about the book. And then, like Nicole said, depending on how many folks we have with us, might go into some breakout rooms to talk a little bit more together about the takeaways from this book. So I'm going to show this, a short section of this interview with the author, and then we will come back together.
Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and as we've reported, this cruelty has surged around the world along with the pandemic due to mandatory lockdowns, with abuser and victim trapped inside together. Our next guest knows firsthand the devastating impact of violence in the home. Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Natasha Trethewey was 19 when her stepfather murdered her mother. This excruciating pain is the subject of her new book, Memorial Drive, A Daughter's Memoir. She also writes about growing up in the 60s in the Deep South as a mixed-race child. And here she is in a raw and often emotional conversation with our Michelle Martin.
Thanks, Christiane. Natasha Trethewey, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I think many people are familiar with your work. You've won multiple awards. You're a respected, highly sought after college professor, teacher, former poet laureate of the United States, a high honor. I feel comfortable in saying that I'm sure millions of people know your work. And I remember reading a brief biography of you. It said her father, Eric Trethewey, was a poet. Her mother died when she was in college. Her mother died when she was in college. So just to get to the core terrible details, your stepfather, your mother's ex-husband, who had physically abused her and, frankly, if I may say, emotionally abused you, killed her when you were only 19 years old. And when she was 40, she had finally gotten free of him. And frankly, he seems to have been threatening her for years, for what I can see. Why this book now? Did this book sort of force its way out of you? Why this book and why now?
I think it did. You know, I've been carrying this grief with me now for 35 years. And more, my mother was being erased. This erasure was ongoing. It was particularly easy for people, as I said, to draw this line straight through my father to me, because my father was a poet. My father was also my white parent. So there was something both racialized and patriarchal in this assumption that I'm who I am because of my father. And it wounded me deeply that people didn't understand that the thing that hurt me into poetry, that the thing that I had tried to contend with my whole adult life was the loss of my mother. I felt like I needed to tell that story and to place who she was and what she meant to me in its proper perspective.
The title of your book, of course, is Memorial Drive, and it comes at this remarkable moment of reckoning for the country, where this country is reckoning with its racial past, as it does periodically. And one of the remarkable things about your book is the way it intertwines your personal history with that of the history of the South and of the country. So to that end, I just wanted to ask if you would mind reading a passage for us.
Oh, of course, I'd be happy to. This is from the first chapter, which is called Another Country. In the spring of 1966, when I was born, my mother was a couple of months shy of her 22nd birthday. My father was out of town traveling for work, so she made the short trip from my grandmother's house to Gulfport Memorial Hospital as planned without him. On her way to the segregated ward, she could not help but take in the tenor of the day. Witnessing the barrage of rebel flags lining the streets, private citizens, lawmakers, Klansmen, often one and the same, raising them in Gulfport and small towns all across Mississippi. She could not have missed the paradox of my birth on that particular day, a child of miscegenation, an interracial marriage still illegal in Mississippi and as many as 20 other states. Sequestered on the colored floor, my mother knew the country was changing, but slowly. She had come of age in the summer of 1965, turning 21 in the wake of Bloody Sunday, the Watts riots, and years of racially motivated murders in Mississippi. Unlike my father, who'd grown up a white boy in rural Nova Scotia, hunting and fishing, free to roam the open woods, my mother had come into being a Black girl in the Deep South, hemmed in, bound to a world circumscribed by Jim Crow. Though my father believed in the idea of living dangerously, the necessity of taking risks, my mother had witnessed the necessity of dissembling, the art of making of one's face an inscrutable mask before whites who expected of Blacks a servile deference.
It's always tricky asking an artist how she makes her art, but I am wondering how you arrived at this voice, how you arrived at this kind of intertwining of the personal with the social story, you know, the mixing of the races, the expectation of white supremacy, expectation of deference. Was it hard?
Well, you know, it took a long time to write this book. It took me 7 years to write the book. And I think part of the hardest thing was to figure out the voice. Who am I in telling this story, and what is the story that needs to be told? I mean, because they're obviously the tragic facts of my mother's life and mine, but that's not the story. And what I realized, and it has everything to do with that intersection of public history, the history of the Civil War and the aftermath, and the monuments we've erected to remember or misremember the Civil War, and my mother's death at the base of Stone Mountain, that largest monument to the Confederacy. Those things converge, and they actually represent my two existential wounds. You know, in his memorial to William Butler Yeats, W.H. Auden wrote, "Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry." Well, likewise, my nation, my native land, my South, my Mississippi, with its history of violence and racial oppression, inflicted my first wound. Being born there on Confederate Memorial Day was as if I were given that history to write. And then when my mother's death occurred at the base of that mountain, I could see how what is remembered and what is not was the very threshold through which to enter this book.
This book is so beautifully written, and yet it is so, if you don't mind my saying, it is so terrible in other ways. Just the recitation of the abuse that was visited upon your mother is very hard to read. It's obviously the remembering and the intuiting of the kind of physical harm that he's inflicting on your mother, but it's also terrifying and horrible to read the harm he inflicted on you in trying to silence you. Mm-hmm. In fact, there's this one passage where you come home and you say, "I'm going to be a writer."
Right.
And he says to you, "You're not going to do any of that."
Right.
I can't think of a more terrible thing to say to a child.
Yes. I mean, I think that anything that seemed like a dream that I had, he was going to try to find a way to shut that down. And that is a very telling moment in my relationship with my mother as well, because she was, you know, obviously enduring physical abuse at his hands, often out of sight, but something I could hear. And for years, in order to kind of do a kind of dissembling and to keep him from going into a violent rage later on out of sight, she would only talk to me about my accomplishments or achievements when he wasn't around. It was something that we had to keep secret. But that particular day, I came home so excited, I couldn't wait. And I said that at the dinner table. And when he said, "You're not going to do any of that," I could see my mother's hand clench the fork she was holding and her jaw clench. And she said, "She will do whatever she wants." And even in that moment, I knew the price that she was going to pay for defending me. And as much as she was, willing to do that and knowing the cost, she wasn't going to let him batter my soul in the same way that he was battering hers.
Mm-hmm. Your stepfather murdered your mother. He murdered her after she had left him after a long history of abuse.
That's right.
That's the foundational fact. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
She'd been divorced from him for nearly 2 years when he murdered her. So she indeed had done everything right and gotten away. And he continued to stalk her. He even went to prison for attempting, well, he wasn't convicted of attempted murder, but he did try to kill her once before. On Valentine's Day in 1984, he went to prison for about a year, but only convicted of criminal trespass. And when he got out, he came back and finished what he started.
So I'm going to pause the video there. The rest of the video we can either put in the chat, a link for people that might want to continue watching it, or it's also available on the Thomas Crane Library event page and listed with a few other resources as well. So I just want to say that I appreciate everyone here taking time out of their kind of daily schedule and daily routine to come and have a conversation about something that can be really difficult to talk about. We know that domestic violence is incredibly common, that there's a really, really high chance that everybody here in this room knows somebody or cares about somebody really close to them that has been affected by this issue. And so reading this book or even watching a clip like that sometimes can make us think about people that we really care about. And so I just want to thank people for being willing to take some time to have what might be a really heavy conversation, but is also really important. I want to say a little bit about Dove and where I'm coming from, a little bit about the connection with some of the work that we're doing and this book. And then just kind of want to open it up for a few minutes to just have anybody here share, ask questions, share, and just kind of chat a little bit. So I see we have some Dove, some friends of Dove here. So very happy to see some familiar faces. Dove is a domestic violence organization based in Quincy. We have been here for just over 40 years. We have two separate programs. We have a shelter, and then we also have a community service office, which is right in Quincy Center. We offer counseling, support groups. We have legal services. Everything we do is free of charge. We work with anybody that has experienced abuse at the hands of a partner, former partner, current partner. So we also do some work in some of the schools in the area, doing some prevention work, and do some trainings and other community work with other service providers as well. So we have a hotline that's available 24/7. I can put all this information in the chat. At the end, we're going to talk just a little bit about how you can support somebody in your life that might be experiencing an abusive relationship. But that's a very high level overview of some of what we do at Dove. So I also want to say a little bit about why we chose this book. So at Dove, we're doing a lot of work internally and sort of our hope is to kind of bring the community into this as conversations about race and social justice. Sometimes people wonder, what is the connection between domestic violence and racism? And so I want to share just a few statistics, local statistics from directly from Massachusetts that just sort of highlight a little bit of this issue. So the Department of Public Health did a study over about 17 years on domestic violence homicides in Massachusetts. So again, this is just focusing on homicides, not the abuse that people might experience that doesn't end in a homicide. And so there were some trends that they found, and those were stratified by race. And so they found that there was a decline in domestic violence homicide overall, about 2.4%, but that was not equally, not all races experienced that same decline. And so what they found was that mostly white women were the ones that experienced that decrease. Black folks and Asian folks experienced no decrease. Hispanics experienced a very negligible decrease, but the rates were very high to begin with. And so what some of these studies found was that Black folks were experiencing homicide by a partner at 4 times the general population. For foreign-born versus U.S.-born survivor victims, immigrants were about 2 times more likely to be killed. And so we really can see how the way people, how people's race has a very direct impact on survival. Which is scary and something that we really need to be talking about. So in some of the breakout rooms, we're going to talk a little bit about what role race may have played in this book, but I'm going to stop talking for a minute and just open things up. And if people have any kind of general reactions to the book, to the video clip, questions about Dove or anything like that, now would be the time.
Well, Jen, I just wanted to say thank you for the information. And I think, highlighting that, racism is the issue and not race. I think a person's race is not what contributes to different outcomes. It's actual systemic and issues in regards to racism. And I was wondering if you had any information in terms of work that's been done to look into some of the systemic issues that contribute to the different outcomes for different racial groups in terms of, and as a nurse, I would think about it in terms of mortality, but in terms of the risk for domestic violence ending in homicide for marginalized groups versus women who are.
So some of it can be access to support services. Whether it's support services like a domestic violence organization or it's accessing the legal system, that may or may not be seen as something that is safe. And so sometimes leaving people with less options. I know we have other experts here as well. And so if anyone else wants to sort of share some thoughts or speak to that.
I'm happy to jump in.
Hi, Liz.
I'm Liz. Hi, Jen. I'm so happy to see you. I'm Liz Speakman. I live in Quincy, and I work for the City of Cambridge, coordinating a domestic violence initiative, and have been doing DV work for over 20 years. But I guess I would echo what Jen said around access to services and supports and resources, and as she said, not just about what's available, but what feels available, and what feels palatable, and like what would actually be helpful. And I think that's one of the things we've dropped the ball on as a domestic violence movement, is really attending to what survivors actually want and need. And we know is survivors want the abuse to stop. But our systems and resources and criminal justice access has not tended to work towards that goal. It's been more about separation, punishing the perpetrator, supporting the victim, rather than really looking at holistic solutions that could end the abuse and potentially even keep the family together, which is really what ultimately a lot of folks would like. And so I think we have a lot of work to do as a field and as a community to figure out, how do we make the services, resources, not only more available and accessible, language capacity, that kind of thing, but also meeting the needs that people are identifying, rather than what maybe 40 years ago we thought, it's prison for this one and shelter for this one. That's actually not the solution. So now we have to backtrack and come up with a solution that's actually going to meet the needs of survivors. And I think that's what Dove is working on, really committed to figuring out. So it's challenging and complicated, I would say.
Thank you. I appreciate that input and insight. And these are very, very challenging topics. I think anytime we're talking about domestic violence, there's so much stigma and kind of a sense of it being a taboo topic to talk about and to think about. And as you said, Jen, it touches everybody. I actually grew up with a young woman who was murdered by her husband when she was 28 years old. It was a murder-suicide that happened in front of their 3 children. And these are things that you think, you hear stories like that and you hear them on the news and you think that happens to other people. And, it happens to people we know, it happens to people we care about, and sometimes it happens to us. And thinking about making it safe, or making it feel like something that does feel like a community issue, as opposed to the family kind of being on their own to deal with it. And so I think that's a big part of having this conversation tonight. And I hope if folks are not joining us tonight, that they'll watch parts of this or access this in their own time. And I also know that we've had some folks who signed on and had to sign off because the topic does trigger a lot of feelings or remembrances of experiences that have happened in their own lives. And so I think in terms of the theme of this conversation being a brave space, this conversation requires a lot of bravery for a lot of reasons for folks.
Thank you, Nicole.
Is there anybody else who has any thoughts or comments about the book or the topic itself, or any questions? And if you don't feel comfortable talking out loud, you can use the chat.
So Jen, I know I get asked this question a lot, and I'm wondering if this is something that's on other folks' minds. If I think my neighbor is being abused, or my friend or my sister or someone discloses to me, what do I say? What do I do?
Yeah. One of the most important things, and one that we've been really trying to help people be creative around during the pandemic, is how to stay in touch and be a support to somebody, even when you might not physically be able to be there. People so often want to tell their friend or neighbor or loved one, like, you should leave and you should break up with this person, and do you see what this is doing to your kids, and this person's never going to change. And You might be thinking a lot of those things. Some of those things might be true. But those are not always the most helpful things to say to someone that might know those things already and really be struggling with how to leave. And so leaving is one of the most dangerous times. We saw that a little bit in this book, where she did all the right things. She left, she got a restraining order, she went to a shelter. She did everything right, and that loss of control was, you could argue, really what resulted in her murder, which is what we see in a lot of the domestic violence homicides in Massachusetts and across the country. So really simple things that you can say to people. I believe you. You don't deserve to be treated that way. I'm here for you. What can I do? Is a lot more helpful than telling someone what to say. I think just hearing "I believe you" and "I'm here for you" are some of the most helpful things. And then if someone is able to encourage them maybe to reach out to a domestic violence organization, to talk to somebody about their relationship, even if it's not with a plan to leave, but maybe just for some emotional support or for some ways to stay safe. Thanks, Liz.
When I watched the video, I was struck by how the abuse stayed with her, even though it's been a long time since the murder. And it brought her to tears.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, after reading it, I was just so, it was like she knew that this was going to happen. The mother, Gwendolyn, like, he's going to kill me, and I'm telling everybody, and I'm doing all the right things. And just what that must have felt like as her daughter to see in just such like a powerless position, that my mom, her mom had a master's in social work and was like this, very intelligent and successful and well-connected person. And she was doing all the right things. And still, her stepfather was able to kill her mother. So I think that was my biggest takeaway is she said this was going to happen and she did all the right things, and she wasn't protected.
She was described as the perfect victim. She didn't seem like a victim. She was professional. She had her own money. It didn't seem like she would be easily controlled.
Mm-hmm. And I think that also helped to show a little bit of, sometimes people have stigmas about who is a victim and what they look like. And her mother really didn't fit into that category of some assumptions that people might make, and had access to money and, like I said, supports and all of that. And still, the control and the violence was there. So powerful. So Nicole, Teresa, what are your thoughts? Do we want to stay together and talk about some of these questions? Do we want to break up into a couple discussion groups? What?
The group is small enough that it would be okay to stay in the main area, as long as Nicole feels the same and you.
Sure. Okay. So like Nicole or Teresa said, if people feel more comfortable in the contributing in the chat, that's great. We can keep an eye out for that as well. But some of the discussion questions that we had were just sort of thinking about, and I know Liz talked about like a question that she gets all of the time about how do you help someone. I always get the question like, why didn't they just leave? And so I thought we could just approach that a little bit. I know outside of this work, it's a question that people always have. If the relationship is so bad, why does someone stay? What did we see in the book that made it hard for her mother to leave? What was it that kept her? And if you didn't have a chance to read the book, just even thinking more generally, people that you know in your life or have heard about, what has kept people from leaving? Vanya. I see that Vanya had her.
Yes, yes, I did. It's Bonnie and Jen.
Hi, Vanya.
Yeah, so I wanted to say in her case, it was kind of hard to see, like, why did she stay? Because like we said, like, she had the career, she had the money, did she stay because of the child that they shared? Because and I forgot what he did for a living, but it looked like she was pretty independent. So I don't know if maybe she didn't want to break up her family. That could be the only thing that I can think of. Because he did end up, and she was an independent woman, in some way, somehow he manipulated her and ended up getting all the control. But she didn't need him. And that's how, we can't have that image of like, the perfect victim, like you said, because, she wouldn't fit that description of being a victim,
Right.
So that's the weird thing. It would be a good thing. And I don't know if her daughter would even be able to answer that question. Like, why did she stay?
I think there was, just reading the transcripts at the end, like it was just, Sarah and I were talking about what that was like to just really feel like you were in the room and seeing exactly what is said between two people and how he was like just trying to pull her into like rationalizing and even romanticizing the murder. It was really, really disturbing, but he was, which we often see with people's abusive partners, are trying lots and lots of different tactics. Sometimes it's fear, like quite literally being afraid for your life, afraid for the safety of your children. Sometimes it's a lot of promises. I'm going to be better. We heard a lot of that in the transcript of like going to counseling and things are going to be different and I'm working on myself. Him blaming what was happening on mental illness. Then sort of talking about, I'm lost without you and there's no point of living. And so threatening suicide. Just like all these different tactics, trying to just see what was going to kind of pull her in. I definitely think, as with many of the people we work with at Dove, there is sometimes a desire to keep a family intact. There's fear of losing custody, which happens all the time. And so we can kind of see, how there's so many different things that were at play there. We sometimes hear from survivors that even though it's scary to be in a relationship with this person, it's less scary to be next to them and know what they might be planning next than to have no contact with them and have no idea what this person might be scheming. And so staying feels safer to a lot of people.
Another thing that I've seen a lot is, one of the, I'd say that there's no abusive relationships without manipulation. It feels like a pretty blanket statement, but I think it's true. Jen, you agree?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And people who are abusive are very, very skilled. They're very skilled at many things. One of them is they're very good at making their partner believe that this is all their fault. And that's, I'd say, across the board. I've never worked with someone who that dynamic was not in play in an abusive relationship. And so there's all these other factors that sort of keep someone in the relationship, these sort of external factors. And there's this internal factor that's I've seen is really rooted in a sense of shame that the survivor has of like, this is like, I really believe that somehow this is actually my fault. And because abusers are so good, they're so skilled at really making you believe that. And so the messages that people who are abusive use end up being the internal dialogue that survivors have in their own head. It's like abusers don't even have to say the things anymore, right? After a while, they just start thinking to themselves, I'm not a good mom. I'm a terrible social worker. You know, I can't keep the house clean. You know, I'm no good in bed. Like all the things that their partner's been saying to them, they just start thinking about themselves. And so when you have that sense of shame and internalized, you know, just lack of confidence in yourself, it's really hard to leave, right? And think like my life could be better, because if I believe it's about me and I am at fault, then I should change. I need to navigate. And well, when I did it this way, it wasn't so bad. So maybe if I try that again, you know, it'll be okay. And then you try it again and you know, it comes at you. And so it's very complicated, I think, for a lot of survivors to not only sort of work through those external barriers of economics and access to resources and the criminal justice system and all this, but then this internal process of like, how do I believe really deeply that this is actually not my fault and I deserve to live a life free of violence? Mm-hmm. And that's a hard path to go down. And so what I've seen is like that actually ends up being a big barrier to people leaving, is that internalized belief that abusers are really skilled at. And with, you know, not just people who are vulnerable, who have a history of trauma or seen abuse in their own childhoods, but like we are all susceptible because abusers are so skilled at it that any of us could be sort of fall into that manipulation and that trap of like, somehow this is my fault. And so I think it like gets to this like deeper level of why people stay in abusive relationships, but it feels to me in my experience part of this picture. I don't know what do you think about that, Jem?
100%. Yes. Like, yeah, the skill of abusive people to blame, especially if you can couple that with isolating somebody. That's just like the perfect recipe for having full control in a relationship, is like, I'm going to blame everything on you and, you know, tear down your self-esteem. Yeah. And make it, you feel like it's your fault and all that. And then I'm also going to, cut you off from your family and your friends and the people that are close to you. You know, sabotage. I know her job was like a point of contention in their relationship. I'm sure because it gave her agency, but also there were people there that may have been checking on her and supporting her and trying to lift her up. And that really directly takes away the control from the abusive person. So yeah, that isolation and the manipulation, I think, go hand in hand a lot. So what could have helped Gwendolyn? We saw, you know, that she did all the right things. It was so tragic to hear at the very end about the police officer, you know, that left, and that was when the murder occurred. But any thoughts just about like maybe specific to this story, what could have helped her, what did she need, or more generally, just how we can support or advocate for survivors. I know, Teresa, I saw a few
I'm just passing them along as
questions, in the chat. We can look at those too. So a question to talk a little bit about red flags in abusive relationships, resources specific to Quincy, share a positive story. We should definitely do that. And again, anyone can kind of chime in and chat along, but red flags early on in an abusive relationship, we're really looking for attempts at control, not just physical abuse, right? And so that's like when we're talking about domestic violence, like really trying to expand the way people think about it beyond someone that may have experienced physical abuse and all that can happen in a relationship that's controlling when there hasn't been any physical or sexual abuse. Attempts for control, early signs we see of trying to sort of keep you all to themselves. Why do you spend so much time with your friends? You talk to your family too much. Some jealousy, maybe some like a fast moving relationship where the person is really quick to profess their love. We have like a whole segment sometimes where we'll talk about romantic gestures that really themselves are red flags, and these kinds of like relationships where this person seems to kind of sweep someone off their feet, and really the fast pace is an attempt to kind of establish control really early on in a relationship. And so there's constant texting and wanting to spend every second together. That can feel really exciting, really fun, and also can be some red flags. What else? What else are people thinking about?
Sorry, I keep jumping in.
Sorry. There was another question just above that too, whenever you get a chance, Jen.
I'll just add, you may tell I have worked with people who are abusive, so I have like some experience there, but they're very charismatic often, not always, but often. And so the beginning of the relationship is often wonderful. And I think survivors often say like, why can't it go back to how it was in the beginning, And so what I've seen is the beginning is really wonderful and exciting and fun, like Jen said. And it's not until you're kind of hooked that the red flags start popping up. Like not until you're feeling more committed to the relationship that this person starts to feel like, okay, now I'm going to start pushing. I'm going to start testing and see like how far I can go. And that's another reason why I think people stay, right? Is like, it was great. It was wonderful. So like, and again, like, what do I need to do in order to get us back to that? I must have started doing something wrong that this started going bad. So how do I get it back to that? And just remembering that like anyone can get hooked in. Anyone can get hooked into that dynamic. It's not certain people are extra vulnerable to it or, not. It's just, it's powerful. And people who are abusive are good at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And especially if someone is with an abusive partner that is charismatic, where everybody else in the community loves them and thinks they're great and they're friends with the neighbors and all this, that just adds so much to the victim or the survivor feeling like it must be their fault because the abusive person gets to say like, everybody else loves me, you're the only one that has an issue with me or conflict. And so that really can reinforce that. So I'll share a few positive things, I guess. So I run a support group that happens on a weekly basis at Dove. And the group is made up mostly of people that have gotten out of their relationships, are sort of on the other end, are not in crisis anymore, but may have been really isolated by their partners and are just sort of looking to build back community and understanding with one another. And so we have a group in total of about 15 to 20 survivors that all sort of come to this drop-in group intermittently and provide support to newer people that are kind of coming in. So this group has been around for like 10 years, and some people have been there the whole time and are just so wonderful at bringing in new folks for support. And so we're able to see, it's one of the ways that we're able to see people that the abuse is long in the past and how they're able to use some of their experiences to help someone else. We also have a few staff members at Dove that identify as survivors that at one time utilized Dove services and really felt a calling to support survivors and to do this kind of work. And it's so important to have survivors lead and be a part of this movement. And so it has been sort of like an honor to continue to work with some of these people as colleagues. So yeah, I'm sure other folks have some positive stories as well. But there was also a question about how LGBTQ status may affect this experience or access to appropriate services. So that's a great question. At Dove, we have an LGBTQ outreach coordinator. That's a position that we created maybe 3 or 4 years ago with the intention of letting the community know that we are more than a battered women's service provider. And so that's kind of like a term that I sometimes still hear, but is certainly outdated, and that we're really trying to intentionally move away from. And so part of that person's role, and really all of our roles, is to let the community know we work with anyone that has experienced abusive relationships. People in the LGBTQ community experience domestic violence at the same rates as women in straight relationships, and trans folks experience domestic violence at extremely high rates. I think the statistics are almost 50%. And so what is our, how can we make sure that the community knows that we're here to serve that community, and how can we also represent that community within our organization so that when people come for services, they see other folks that look like them. And that's an important thing for us to do with all of our services, to be inclusive. And so it's work that we're always continuing to do at Dove. And there's been a lot of work across the state to continue to make services more inclusive, and more work that needs to happen. Yeah. So what other questions did folks have?
Jen, can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. One of the things that I was thinking about is that when you brought up the question of, when people think, well, why don't they just leave? And how this, and to, Liz's comment about often in the beginning, things are really good. And there's kind of what we might think about as the honeymoon phase. But also that often, in families and in relationships, things can be complex and many things can be true at the same time. So you can be afraid of somebody and love them at the same time. You can want to help yourself and want to help them at the same time. You can want to think about how you're keeping your children safe and yourself, and what you need to do to maneuver that at the same time. And then I think about, you alluded to this in the beginning about whether or not people feel safe or maybe have trust in accessing certain resources. But if the way to access those services is through the police, that is not necessarily going to be an acceptable option to a lot of folks, particularly people of color, potentially, who may have a relationship with the police that's very, that it's not a source of help, and it would be something that they would not want to subject themselves or their loved ones to. And I think those are things that I was thinking about as you guys were, as you ladies were talking about that, in terms of just thinking about the layers of complexity. And in terms of thinking about locally how this impacts Quincy, just two local things. One, I know there's some stuff happening in the high school with I'm not sure the specific details, but online bullying and sexual harassment, and I think even allusions to rape, in terms of some high school students harassing fellow female students. And Dove, I believe, is going to be working with the high school and the superintendent on that issue. But also, how does Dove interact with other services in the city of Quincy, like our first responders and police department?
So one of, I think, the most important things that Dove has done in the last 10 years is really build up our relationships with the people in our community. And for a long time, I think Dove and other organizations were just very insular, like working just sort of internally. And I think one of the best things we've done in the last 10 years is really, really build up our relationships with the schools, with other providers in the community. We do have a civilian domestic violence program. And so we have 3 staff members that cover 8 different police stations across Norfolk County. We've had a staff person at Quincy Police Department for over 10 years, and are also connected to Weymouth and Dedham and Norwood and Milton and Braintree and Weymouth and Randolph, Holbrook. I'm forgetting which ones I already said, but so those staff are they're Dove staff, but they sit at the police stations and follow up with anyone that has called the police for a domestic violence incident in that city or town. And so they call to check in. How are you doing? Do you know that there's free services? And then inquiring about the police response. How was that? And providing that feedback to the police departments with the hope of improving that response. That is one way that a lot of folks find themselves coming to Dove or hear about Dove. We have staff that also cover Quincy District Courthouse on Fridays during their restraining order hearings. They talk with anyone that has gone for a restraining order or receives a restraining order, and lets them know about services at Dove. We're connected to a lot of the medical providers in the area and doing training for nurses and other folks that work directly with patients. And then some of our deepest relationships are with the schools. And so we have been partnered with Quincy and North Quincy High School for over 10 years, doing peer-led work with students that are interested in partnering with us. And then more recently have been connected to the middle schools in the area and doing some programming with those students as well. And so we very recently in the last year or two were able to hire a children's coordinator, and so are now able to provide services to students that are under 18, either that have experienced abuse in their own relationships or have witnessed it at home. And so that is another way that sometimes people find themselves at Dove.
I just want to say one thing. It's actually important to have the Dove advocates in police departments, because a lot of times the officers are getting frustrated going to the same calls over and over and over again. And one thing that I had to bring up to an officer just yesterday, he was talking about how many domestic violence calls that he goes to. He's just like, I just don't understand why they just don't leave. I said, there's so much, and this is after my own Dove training, by the way, that I've attended. I said, it's not that easy. I said, you're thinking it in the wrong way. Like, it's not that easy. They can't just leave. There's so much more to it. But a lot of times the officers are just frustrated with the calls, and they're not thinking what the victim's going through and how the difficulties how difficult it is for them to get out of the situation. So that's why I think it's important for them to have the training that Dove provides and to have that person there too that can give them like that different outlook in what the victim's dealing with.
Thanks, Vanya.
Thank you for sharing that with us and also with the other officer. I think sometimes it's like in the moment, if you can like catch someone when they're feeling a certain way, that's the time that they might be willing to kind of listen rather than, after the fact going back to it. So I appreciate your willingness to do that.
But I appreciate Dove, because prior to that, I didn't know. There was so much more that I didn't know. So now it's just like, no, you're wrong about that.
It's true. And how would you know, right?
That's so true. And that's how when Jen had asked the question, why didn't she leave? It's like, okay, well then, after you spoke and then Jen said her portion, then I'm just like, wait a minute, there's so much more. I'm thinking that it's so easy. Like, hey, we have this woman that has it all. Why doesn't she just leave? Listen, there's so much more. And at one point he did try to kill her daughter. And there's other reasons why she probably stayed too, that you're not thinking about it when you're going in as like the officer on the call and you're thinking, it's so much easier, but we're not thinking about how difficult it is. And I had told that officer yesterday, I told him, said, you got to think about financial situation. You got to think about homelessness. Do they have somewhere to go? Is there a shelter for them to go? Where are they going to? There's so much more that when you first think about it, you don't understand unless you speak to someone that deals with this type of call on a daily basis, which I have to say, by the way, you would absolutely need somebody else to talk to when you're seeing this kind of stuff over and over and over again, and you're hearing the same stories. Because when I read the book, towards the end, I was just like, how did this happen? She did everything right. And then still no one could help her. Like, to me, that was the shock. So I'm just like, I can't do this kind of job, because it's just like, it has to be draining, right?
I mean, so what I would say is yes, absolutely. And for me, I get to see like the resilience in people too, when you've been through hard things, we've all been through hard things, different kinds of hard things. But when you go through something really hard and you come out on the other side and you're like, I did that thing, right? Like there's this sense of like, you know what? I'm stronger than I thought I was. And we get to see that. Like we get to see people, we get to bear witness to people going through like literally the hardest things you can imagine and coming out on the other side and being able to walk with someone on that journey is really amazing, and such a gift. And that's where my heart always actually goes out. I work a lot with the police department in Cambridge with my job, and they don't get to see that, right? Like you show up to a call, you do the report, maybe you tell them about 209A or whatever, and then you're gone. And then you come back a week later and you're like, what the hell, what's going on? We get to see, as advocates, we get to see that progression from like one call to the next where they're like, I actually don't know if he's going to change. And you're like, yeah, I don't know. He might not, and then like the next time it's like, maybe it's not my fault. Like, yeah, maybe it's not, and we get to sort of see that and see the resilience build, and not everyone gets to see that. And so it's also a gift.
Finally, Jen, is there anything you want to say about how the pandemic has impacted your work specifically, or how, I know we heard a little bit about that in some of the materials if people checked it out to prep for this talk, but in terms of access to shelter or services, or your ability to have face-to-face interactions or virtual interactions, or how are you working with the people you serve in the setting of the pandemic?
Yeah. So we have continued to offer all of our services virtually. So our shelter remained operational, but folks were put into hotel suites so that they were given some space from other families. Our counseling, our support groups, our legal advocacy, our hotline, all of that has continued to operate either over the phone or over Zoom. I'd say for a very maybe small percentage of people for which transportation was difficult, or work commitments, other things like that, being able to utilize some services over Zoom has been helpful. I think for a majority of people, especially those of which that continue to be living with their abusive partner, their risk has gone way up, their isolation, they become more and more isolated, and reasons they may have been able to use to get out of the house and get support from others or to access services at Dove, they no longer have those opportunities. And so, for a lot of folks, they find themselves in much more dangerous situations. Liz, I don't know if you want to share about your program.
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic's been hard for everybody. And I think the pandemic is a crisis, is a trauma. And when you layer that on top of the daily trauma and crisis of DV, it's just additive. And the cumulative effect of that, I think, is something a lot of people are feeling.
I appreciate you guys sharing that. As a nurse, so much has changed with how we care for people during the pandemic, particularly in the community. But I think it's important for people to know that the pandemic hasn't shut down services, and it hasn't taken away the ability to offer people shelter or a way to get out if they're in crisis, that those services have continued and are still accessible to people. I think it's really helpful for the community to understand that even though we are in the context of the pandemic, services are still available. And, there is shelter available, even if it's a little different than the way it looked before the pandemic.
And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the way that the services work. like for anybody that's interested in receiving services, is there like an intake procedure? Generally how that works?
Yeah, so people, you don't need a referral from anybody. You can call us directly. I'll put our contact information, website, and all that in the chat before we close up. But yeah, folks, if someone's interested in any of our services, whether it's a support group, meeting with an individual advocate or counselor, or any of our legal services, they call our main office number. They leave a message on our intake line, and someone will call them back within usually 1 or 2 business days. Just ask a little bit of information about what has been happening in their relationship, and then we'll connect them to schedule an appointment. And so we are very, very rarely ever on a wait list. So we're most oftentimes able to get people connected with someone pretty readily. Especially certainly if someone's in a high risk situation, we can connect them with someone almost immediately. Our hotline is available and answered 24/7. That's a great resource for people that just aren't necessarily in an immediate physical danger, but just might want to talk with someone for some emotional support. And yeah, all of our services are totally free of charge.
So I have a question about that. How are you all funded?
Yeah. So we are just a little over half of our funding comes from the Department of Public Health. We have a couple of large fundraisers each year, apply to some smaller grants, and have some individual donors that support us as well. If anybody has questions about what we do at Dove, is interested in like hosting a presentation or a mini workshop or training at their work or in a community group they're involved in. Also, if people have concerns about their own relationship or people that they're connected to that you're worried about and are looking for some support or ideas of how to support that other person, you certainly can use my email and we can connect. Just encouraging people to be thoughtful of any email trails that may be accessible to someone that might be abusive, and sort of seeing if folks are reaching out in any way. So I'll just say, and I'm sure that Nicole and Teresa have some closing thoughts, but again, just thanking, I know this is a heavy conversation, but such an important one, and really, really appreciate people taking their time to talk about how they can help their community, how they can support people in their lives, to just learn a little bit more about some of the experience of others. Great to be in conversation with you all. So thank you.
Thank you, Jen. I just want to say thank you again for joining us for this one, and again to Nicole and March Forward Quincy for facilitating this and bringing us together in the community. It's been a really wonderful experience.
Thank you, everybody. And yeah, these are hard conversations, and they can bring up a lot of feelings or past experiences for a variety of reasons. So thank you for making space for this tonight, and learning more about some of the work that's going on in our community to address issues like this. And thank you very much to Jen and Dove for stepping up and stepping into this conversation and leading us tonight. We very much appreciate it.